Hello. So, I hope that everything's going well for you in your first week and you're getting accustomed to the class and you've had some time to play around in there. And, you know, as you can see, you can access, all the folders. You just can't take all the quizzes. Don't be intimidated by the quizzes. They're there just to, be a knowledge check for you. You get 2 attempts if you don't realize that yet. So what I want to talk about briefly today is within chapter 1, it's kind of laying the foundation, for what we're going to be looking at, which this class in and of itself is the foundation for what we look at in psychology. So today I want to talk about, the purpose of theories, and then what the characteristics are of a good theory, because this is important. It's important for pretty much any discipline to have sound and valid, as much as possible, theory development. And, I'm working with a HD camera here and in my office, so I apologize if the perspective's not that great. But either way, I'm going to talk about when you talked about, and basically, I'm just pulling from slides 16 and 17 within chapter 1. If you're wondering what that's about, but I do find this to be one of the important pieces of what it means to kind of be able to say something about something, because that's essentially what we're doing. Whenever theories are being developed, it usually comes from somebody made an observation and they wanted to test that observation through various methods that you learn about in your stats class and your research class, so that they could say something significant about some particular human phenomenon. Right? That's a lot of kind of what goes on. Now, some of the purposes that are suggested by the authors of the text as it goes with theories. If I have a belief about something, that's one thing, right? But it's another thing if I can provide some kind of basis for judging the accuracy of that belief, right? For being able to say, okay, I believe that individuals that smile in their driver's license photos receive tickets less than those individuals that did not smile in their driver's license photo. Okay, sounds kind of crazy. But let's say I have this belief. Well, I need to find some way to validate that belief. So I need to find some evidence, right? I need to hustle up some data, or data, however you prefer to say it. So, that's one reason that we, and so we go and you that doesn't become a theory in and of itself. Say I go and I research, I find the reports of individuals that have received, driving awards, so driving citations, and then compare that to their driver's license photo and see if I'm finding something significant there as far as an overwhelming amount of individuals that that didn't smile in their photos, receiving tickets, which there again, you can already see where this is. There's going to be a lot of confounding variables there, and it's in that, how many people actually do smile in their driver's license photo? Who's actually ever happy to be at the DMV? I've seen people smile in their driver's license photos as a joke. They do this real big crazy smile. But either way, say I wanted to support the notion that, say somebody has a belief that addiction is a disease. Ooh, it's controversial, right? It's a controversial thing to say. But let's just say somebody has a notion that addiction is a disease. Well, you better have some way to support such a strong claim. Which there are people out there that have gone and done so. They'll use the classic, Olds and Milner study where there's you're probably familiar with the study, but where you had the rats and they're sitting there pressing this lever and the lever does is it delivers essentially dopamine, which delivers pleasure to the rats, and that the rats would just sit there and keep pushing that lever and keep pushing that lever. They would deny food, they would deny sex, they would deny anything of significance. In fact, some would just sit there and keep pushing that lever and just fry on the this electric grate, all because they were getting this flood of dopamine into their brain. Well, that really goes to show the biological side of addiction, I guess you could say, in that there's not really any. From what I know, mice don't have morals or values. They're not necessarily we have choices, right? We have a frontal cortex. We can make choices. We can make decisions. Rats don't have environmental influences. There's not any rat gangs out there selling rats drugs. So it's one example that kind of supports the biological notion of addiction. Very simply, the disease model is organ defect symptom, and in the case of addiction, the suggested model there is that the organ is the brain, that the defect is an inability to accurately and successfully perceive pleasure, believe it or not. If you think about what drugs do, they all deliver dopamine, and so kind of this inability to accurately perceive pleasure. And then the symptoms that you see are tolerance, continued use despite negative consequence, loss of control, inability to stop, things like that. Okay, so I've said a lot, right, as it goes with that particular belief. Now I better have some way, to support that. It's dangerous to ever use the word prove when it comes to human phenomenon. What we're oftentimes doing, especially in this field, is supporting, our notions with data. And then that can change, and we want that to change, right? Whenever we start getting into the characteristics of good theory here in a second, we'll talk about how, it is important for that to be able to happen. So, again, one of the main purposes, right, it provides a basis for judging the accuracy and usefulness of beliefs. Hopefully it simplifies and organizes observations. One thing to keep in mind is there's this reciprocal process as it goes with data and theory. Data driving theory and theory driving data, right? And so, and that goes back into, rationalism and empiricism, right? The empiricists are the data gatherers, right? And the rationalists are the theory developers, right? They're the thinkers. I'm not saying that empiricists aren't, but if you're wanting to draw, because the book, it talks about rationalism and empiricism and kind of the development of all of that. Rationalism fits in with theory and theory development. Empiricism fits in with data gathering, right? Picture Aristotle, with a little magnifying glass sitting there doing data, because Aristotle was an empiricist and Plato a rationalist. And what you see is they both need each other, right? Oh, I have this theory, I have this belief about this particular human phenomenon, but I don't have any data to support it. Well, then all I have is a belief. I have a notion. I have no data to support it. And then on the other side, I have all this raw data, right? I'm seeing that something's happening, right? I keep seeing the same thing over and over and over again, right? I need some kind of organizing framework for that. I need a theory, right, to help me organize that data. So you really can't have one without the other, for the most part. Another thing is helping us to provide a basis for making predictions. Again, when we get into the characteristics of a good theory, you'll see why it's important for that to to happen, for us to be able to make predictions, because that's what we want to be able to do. We don't only want to be able to explain, we want to be able to predict. Especially when we're talking about things related to the survival of a species. If we're talking about things that are very, very important, right? If we can find, some kind of statistically significant, report or statistically significant correlation between two variables, and we keep seeing that over and over and over again, then we could possibly make predictions. Whatever that might look like, so we're not only wanting to explain, we're also wanting to be able to predict. And then another thing with theories is that we want them to be able to suggest and highlight those facts which are most important, and then also look at the relationships among variables. Again, I wouldn't be able to say that, okay, not smiling in my driver's license photo causes me to get a ticket. Correlation does not equal causation. Correlation does not equal causation. Correlation does not equal causation. You see, I said that 3 times. That's something very important to imprint in your brain. However, it can be a start. So in other words, we find a correlation between some variables when we're doing quasi-experimental research. Well, we can't make causal conclusions. The only time we can make causal conclusions is when we're doing true experimental research. So we go and we find, okay, I think I just got shut out here. Sorry about that. So we go and we find a correlation between variables, so that gives us a starting point. Right? We find a relationship amongst variables, so that gives us a starting point. Another example I can think of correlation not equaling causation, there's definitely a relationship between the opening of an umbrella and it raining, right? So I open like it's raining. Me opening the umbrella is related to it raining. However, me opening an umbrella doesn't cause it to rain. Yeah, raining does more than likely cause me to open an umbrella, but opening an umbrella does not cause it to rain. So I would say there's a correlation between umbrella opening and the rain. Just things like that, right? And very, very, there's not a lot of things that we can draw complete causal conclusions for. I know we want to, right? It seemed like for a while there, one week coffee causes cancer, the next week coffee causes something positive. Like one week coffee's good for you, 1 week coffee's bad for you. But really, that's whenever we have folks taking things out of context and making causal conclusions because they read some research and they find what's actually a relationship amongst variables. Saying this causes this is very dangerous. Saying this particular variable causes this particular outcome or this particular phenomenon, that can be dangerous if we don't have adequate data to support that, and that takes some time. It's not just a once over and then we're good. So we must be careful with that. We must be careful when we're evaluating things that we read, which goes into another important piece, is just to question anything that you read. Question your textbook. We like to suggest, and again, this is why theory development is so important, this is why research is so important, is we like to suggest that the horse's mouth, so to speak, so the end game, the end word, is supposed to come from unbiased, empirically validated, peer-reviewed research. So those journal articles that we try to get you to read, there's a reason for that. Because what happens is you have some popular media source take some research study that was done, and they put their spin on it. They put what fits with their bias, and it may not be the accurate actual report of that particular study. And you will see this a lot. If you're ever reading something, right, and you see names in parentheses, right, that's a citation. And usually you can go find that, go to a reference section and find that citation, find that reference listed, find that author listed, and then go find what it is that they're referencing. Side note, that's how I learned to write. I would look at professional journals and I would see them cite, so there'd be a name in parentheses, and I'd see them cite a piece of information, so then I would go to the reference section, I would find that author, right, and then I would take that and go find that article, and then I would see how this professional took this professional's information, right, and kind of put it in their own words, so where they didn't plagiarize, which sometimes you see, but where they put it into their own words, where they were, able to paraphrase, and how they're using it to support what they're trying to say. Because that's another thing with theory development and data, is we're usually trying to support whatever it is we're trying to say with evidence. So hopefully you got a good idea of that as far as the purpose of theories. Another thing about theories is that they're not necessarily to be evaluated in terms of right or wrong. In fact, it's okay to be wrong. There's a saying that I've heard before where, a researcher's talking about another researcher's theory, and this goes into one of the characteristics of a good theory. Said, that guy's theory, it's trash. And it's not that it's not right, it's that it's not even wrong. So what this person's saying is, I can't test it, I can't verify it, it's not useful, right? That's one of the big criticisms of Freudian theory, is a lot of his beliefs, a lot of his assumptions are not verifiable. Now they're getting to where I think that they're going to be able to, giving the ways that we can now look at the brain. So please understand, theories are not supposed to be looked at in terms of being right or wrong as much as they are judged mainly by their usefulness. So what makes a theory useful? All right, so what are the characteristics of a useful theory? These are things that I would probably commit to memory and want to know, not only for this course, but just in general, because in your other classes, I know in my personality class, what we're doing is we're evaluating, various theorists' theories, right? How well does this theory, for one thing, how does it reflect the facts? So what we mean when we say that is exactly that. How well does it actually, report the things that we've observed? How well does it summarize and organize these observations? And does it do it in a manner that can, again, be validated? Is there something out there where we've, been able to say, okay, I have this observation, I have this data to support it, so this particular theory needs to do a good job of supporting that data. Social cognitive theory, through Bandura, I feel like it does a great job meeting these various characteristics that we're talking about as it goes with things related to a useful theory, because it takes into consideration not only the nature, right? Not only the nurture, right? One of the classic questions, is it nature, is it nurture? Right? Is it biological, is it environmental? Right? In my first class each day, which I'm not getting to do, obviously, is I ask, how many people believe it's all nature? And you know what I mean when I say that, right? How many people believe it's all nurture? How many believe there's this beautiful, nuanced interaction between both nature, nurture, both biology, environment? The answer is that, right? Very few things are all based on biology or all based on nature. Very few things are based all on environment or all nurture. Colorblindness, or as I would call it, an inability to accurately perceive the electromagnetic spectrum. I don't think I've ever heard anyone refer to it as that, but I have a friend that's colorblind and he likes me to be sensitive to that. So that's what I started saying. But that, 100% nature, right? You're born with that. There's no amount of training. There's no amount of conditioning. There's nothing I can do to make you not colorblind. On the other side, nurture, environmental side, the language that you speak, 100% environmentally determined. Not that you can speak language, right? Like the language acquisition device. No, but that the type of language that you speak, 100% nurture, 100% environmental. Not a lot of things we can say that. Most things have this beautiful interaction between both. So if somebody came along with a theory and they tried to say, this particular, back to, addiction. I do not believe addiction is 100% nature, right? There's 5 theories associated with addiction. Genes, reward, memory, stress, choice. All 5 of those have their own little world in there. So obviously choice and stress and reward, those things, those are environmentally influenced. So if somebody tried to come along and say, oh yeah, addiction's 100% nature. No, that's not adequately reflecting the facts, right? So that's what we mean when we're talking about, does it reflect the facts? Is it really reflecting the observations? Is it clear and understandable? Another problem with Freudian theory. It's just too convoluted. The behaviorists came along and they basically just put Freudian theory and put those psychoanalysts on a crutch because they could say this is not clear and understandable. This is based on introspection. This is based on unidentifiable or unobservable phenomenon. Whereas we have a theory, we have a system that you can measure. Right? That's why behaviorism lasted for as long as it did, as it goes with the schools of psychology. If you're wondering, it's essentially, psychoanalysts, behaviorists, cognitivism, and humanism. Those are the 4 kind of schools that I kind of subscribe to. There's other people will say other things, and that's fine. But either way, behaviorism lasted for quite a long time because it was easy to understand. It was verifiable. You could measure, right? Instead of saying I'm feeling anxious, or somebody comes and says I'm feeling anxious, and then you have them describe what's going on, behaviors say, look, we can have an operational definition for this, and we can define anxious as, this level of skin conductance, right? This pace of pulse or heartbeat, this level of blood pressure, redness in the face, whatever the individual's symptomatology is of anxiety, right? Because that's something that's hard to really nail down, right? Like sometimes we're feeling anxious, but are we talking about clinical anxiety to the point of diagnoses, or what are we talking about? So behaviorists came along and they simplified things for the most part, and they have easy ways to measure things or measure phenomenon. Right? If I'm working in a place and we need to have a behavioral intervention for a child that's extremely aggressive, well, I need to get a baseline, right? Instead of relying on reports from observers or having the person explain, what do? I observe them and then I count how many times they engage in what I have defined as a physical act of aggression. So that way it's very clear to everybody, we're talking about physical aggression, we're saying actual physical aggression, not verbal aggression, not relational aggression, but whenever they hit, punch, kick, put their hands on, bite, anything physical, then we mark that as physical aggression. You see what I'm saying? Like aggression, broad term. Physical aggression defined as very clear, very understandable. Is it useful? So we've had, does it reflect the facts? That's one of the big keys. Is it clear and understandable? Another big key. Is it useful for predicting as well as explaining? Again, this goes back to what I was talking about. We want to be able to, well, if you're in certain fields, right, you want to be able to help, right? If you're, I'm an LPC, like I guess my area of expertise is clinical, is counseling. So, it happens a lot. Like, you'll have people in a lab come up with what they call evidence-based treatment, which usually, becomes cognitive behavioral therapy. Why? Because it's very easy to measure, it's very easy to explain, and so there you have the people in the lab, and they're coming up with their manual that they think you should use to treat people. And so they come and say, look, this explains, individuals that are displaying, signs of, we could say clinical anxiety, we could say clinical depression, so perhaps maybe some mood disorders. And then the people out, practicing, they go back to the person and they're like, this manual, okay, sure, it does a good job of explaining, but it does not do a good job of predicting, and it is not effective, right? Which is the next one, being practically useful, right? So predicting as well as explaining, because again, that's great. Now I can define and we can explain like the behavior. So we can explain, this is physical aggression. Cool. Does the theory help to predict when we're going to see an individual engage in physical aggression? All right, so you get the point. Like a useful theory is not only one that explains, but it also can predict. We also can say, well, based on social cognitive theory and specifically modeling, because we've seen over time that if you put an individual that another individual identifies with and they want to emulate, and they have the ability to emulate, that you're probably going to see some modeling occur. Right? Think of the Bobo doll experiment. Think about why media tries to control what it is and who it is that the youth see or that we see. It's very intentional, right? I could go on and on about that, but I won't. Point is, social cognitive theory talks about modeling. It's useful because it explains, okay, well, why did this person engage in this particular behavior? Well, maybe it's because they saw their role model, right, engage in that behavior, and I look like them and I want to be like them, right? And so that's what I ended up getting. Did it again. I need to change that. Sorry. I don't know if I'm disappearing or not. See, my screen goes black. Okay, so we've talked about it being useful for predicting and explaining. So reflecting the facts, clear and understandable, predicting as well as explaining, being practically useful. Again, so it's great. You come up with some kind of convoluted theory, but it doesn't really do a good job of predicting, and it's also just not, in general, practically useful. Then we're gonna, you may not evaluate that theory again as being very useful. Is it internally consistent? So this is where things get interesting. If you've already learned, you have internal consistency and external consistency, or internal validity, external internal consistency, which you can almost call reliability. Again, that goes back to the example of, so you have a researcher that's trying to find a manual that's effective, in addressing challenging behaviors or disruptive behaviors of children in school. So within their lab, they develop this manual and they test it on individuals, but it's in a perfect laboratory, like sterile environment, like sterile setting. And that's what I was talking about. So yeah, it worked in the lab, and then you give it to the people that are out there using it and practicing. They're like, this isn't work. It doesn't work out here. It works in there, but it doesn't work out here. And here's why. And it could be because it's not accounting for this, or it's not accounting for that. So we do want things to be internally consistent, yes. So that way we can say we've seen this not only once, not only twice, 3 times, 4 times, right? It goes into reliability, right? Something can be reliable but not valid. Hopefully you understand that. So for example, I step on a scale, so I'm not really, that small, right? So, I step on a scale and it tells me I weigh 110 pounds, and it does that over and over and over and over again every time I step on the scale. That's absolutely consistent. That's absolutely reliable. Not valid. So you can have reliability and not validity. You can't have validity and not reliability. So That's what we're talking about when we're talking about internal consistency. Those are terms that you learn and talk a lot about in the different types of reliability and the different types of validity in your research class. Is it based on many unverifiable assumptions? Okay, so this is always fun. You know, when we're talking about something being based on unverifiable assumptions, I can't help but go to, and it's also tied to it being clear and understandable. I'll talk about that in a second, so there was an example I missed. Based on many unverifiable assumptions. How many of you subscribe to the zodiac, to astrology, to horoscopes? So that is a pseudoscience, okay? You can't test it. It's vague. Another problem with Freudian theory, it was vague. You couldn't test it. So when we're talking about is this theory based on unverifiable assumptions, it goes back to that example I gave where I said it's not that the theory's not right, it's that it's not even wrong. Perfect example. You can't test it. It's not falsifiable. Same thing with horoscopes. They're not testable. They're not falsifiable. Please stop relying on those for decision making. You probably don't if you're a psych major. You've probably been told this before. Sorry though. Yes, they're fun. They're intriguing. Sometimes they do seem pretty on. But you've got to remember, it's not verifiable. It's not testable. For instance, here's an example of a good horoscope for the day. As soon as you finish watching this video, you're going to walk outside and you're going to get punched in the face by a man wearing a green hat and red shorts. That's verifiable. That's testable. Right? I can go and if I walk outside and I get hit in the face by a person wearing a green hat and red shorts, then that was a good prediction. That is a good horoscope because it's either it happened or it didn't. You know, if I read some horoscopes to you, which I'm not going to do, I'll save you that. You would see very clearly that that they're vague. So next time you have a chance, go through and read some horoscopes, and you'll see how vague they are. And with that, they're not clear and understandable either. They're vague. They make unverifiable assumptions. When we're talking about things being clear and understandable, there's a very important piece that I left out, and it's a term. It's something known as Occam's razor. Right. If you want to remember that, you know, Occam's razor, a close shave every time. What do you mean by that? Well, we're talking about Occam's razor. We're talking about the law of parsimony. We're talking about the law of parsimony. What we're suggesting is the simplest and shortest, yet comprehensive, so that explains it as necessary, but that can do so in the most simplest and understandable form is the one to use. So law of parsimony, right? Classic saying, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, let me qualify. If you are in Texas and you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. That's the shorter and simpler explanation. That's the more likely explanation, right? Now, if you're in the, in a place that zebras readily inhabit, and you hear hoofbeats, then you think the other way, right? But you see what I'm saying? The law of parsimony. You know, we have a tendency sometimes when we get into our grad work and we're doing clinical type assessments to for it to be that rare, 1% or not even 1% chance disorder or disease, right? When, med school syndrome is what they call it, when really it's just common cough, it's common flu, common cold, whatever. So that's what we're talking about. It's probably not that rare disorder. It's probably not that rare, unheard of disease. Sometimes it may be, right? Another example is if, I'm sitting here and I have a banana in my ear and I'm snapping my fingers, right? And then my friend comes along and it's like, hey, why do you have that banana in your ear and why are you snapping your fingers? Saying, well, it's keeping the elephants away. And he's like, elephants? I don't see any elephants. And I'm like, yeah, it's working. Right? That's not the explanation. The explanation is that it'd be pretty hard for one, elephants don't readily inhabit Texas, and they don't readily, go on college campuses. So hopefully you get the point when we're talking about something being clear and understandable. This law of parsimony. So, does it reflect the facts? Is it clear and understandable? Is it useful for predicting as well as explaining? Is it practically useful? Is it internally consistent? Is it based on many verifiable assumptions? And I've given you examples of all of these. And then finally, is it satisfying and thought-provoking? And what I would even go a little bit further to say, is it provocative? In other words, does it get the people... Okay, does it generate a lot of research? Here's the thing. Because of how controversial Freudian theory was, it absolutely sparked all kinds of other research, right? It got people going. So that's what we're talking about. Is it satisfying and thought-provoking? Does it generate new research would be the more, the better way to say it, right? In other words, does this theory lay the groundwork for doing new research and more research? Any theorist that says that their theory is perfect and cannot be modified is out of their mind, basically. Because think about what we knew and then what we know, right, and what we continue to know, right? Whenever we're talking about knowledge development, right, you have this dialectic that occurs, right, where you have a thesis and you have an antithesis to that thesis, right? So, you've seen this all throughout history. And then eventually, so you have this thesis and you have this antithesis, and then eventually you get a synthesis. And then that synthesis turns into a thesis that turns into, and then there's an antithesis for that, and then you have another synthesis, right? And then that's how we continue to grow and learn and develop knowledge, right? Back to the, the thesis, from a, let's say a behaviorist perspective was, okay, behaviorism, things are environmentally determined, the brain is a black box. Again, that's radical behaviorism. The brain is a black box, right? It's not, what's going on in here doesn't matter. If I don't see it, if I don't observe it, it didn't happen. Okay, so then the cognitivists come along and they're like, no. Not that they weren't already around, but and so they're in direct opposition of each other, right? So, they go back and forth, and are metaphorically attacking each other, via journal article, which if you ever want to read something interesting, just look at, Skinner and Chomsky and how they went back and forth as it went with language, and basically what ended up happening to kind of knock Skinner off as he overstepped his bounds, right? He got way out of his wheelhouse. So back to what I was talking about. Behaviors here, economists here, and then they drive by each other's houses, shooting them up over and over, and then you have these, not really, right? But you get the point, they're in direct opposition of each other. Well, today, we have a synthesis of that. It's called cognitive behavioral therapy, if we're talking about the application of these two theories, right? This beautiful synthesis of how we can take into consideration what's going on in the mind, right? We can take in cognitions, right? Interpretations, perceptions, beliefs, values, memory, things like that, right? So we have cognitions, and then we have the environmental influences, and we have the actual external behavior, right? But we now say there's this beautiful nuanced interaction between cognitions and behavior, and that you can't explain, this particular phenomenon without taking into consideration both cognitions and behaviors. So hopefully you get the point there. So that's what we're talking about, things being satisfying and thought-provoking. Does it generate research like that? Does it make people come along and say, well, I see what you're saying, but we need to maybe modify it here, do this, do that, right? Theories are not static. They're meant to continue to be altered and changed, and hopefully you get that. Hopefully you understand that. Okay, so we talked about the purposes of theories, and yes, I spent a lot of time on this because it is so important to me that you understand just how we need to use theories and we need to, and how we need to use theories, and how we need to understand data gathering, why it's so important to have both, especially, you had all the alternative facts, right? And you have fake news stories. That's popular media. And yeah, what's dangerous is whenever someone takes empirical research, supposed to be unbiased research, and use it to support, their particular claim, and they take it completely out of context. So you want to know that. You want to be able to go and evaluate that article. You want to evaluate what theory, what is the organizing framework of this data? What is it that they were really saying? How do they analyze the data? And that's why you want to know stats, right? So psychology is a science. We have the scientific method, which I don't believe that it's this static linear process that you usually learn about as it goes to the scientific method. It's more of a kind of circular process, and most researchers will tell you that today. So anyway, we talked about the purposes of theories. Hopefully you understand that. We talked about what the characteristics of a good theory are, and hopefully you understand, although I don't like to use the word good, we talked about the characteristics of a useful theory, right? And what it's based on, and again, it's slide 17 if you're wondering on the PowerPoints. So that's enough for me. Continue on working on chapter 1, chapter 2, so folder 1. Again, I moved the due date of June 19th to June 20th because for whatever reason, pretty much everything you need Tarleton network-wise is going to be down Saturday. So from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. So you have an extra day there to get those things completed. Don't hesitate to call, email if you have any questions, comments. I appreciate the feedback I've been getting. So y'all stay awesome. Have a great day.